Well, good evening. Uh, it's a complicated thing to talk about because I don't, for instance, believe that we have journalism any longer. It's a pretty pathetic situation. I don't know how many of you read the profile on the Times of India in the New Yorker magazine, which was just a little bit better than the one in Caravan. And in the New Yorker, what made it better was that Vineet Jain, who has many problems that his brother doesn't, which is that his brother has silence and Vineet Jain is allowed to speak to the press, decided to inform the reporter, Ken Oleta from the New Yorker, that they are not in the news business, he said. A direct quote, he said, "We are in the advertising business." And of course, news is important because then we get readers, because we need to actually reach the ads to them. There's no point just printing paper with ads if nobody's reading it. So the news is important, but it's subsidiary, it's a second order thing to the ads. Now, this is not a neutral statement. It has a huge impact on how news is reported. And of course, nowhere so more obviously than on television, where you try to hit stories as dramatically as possible. And those of you who've ever had the misfortune of being interviewed for a news program on television will know that if you say 3 sentences as an answer to the question, they will ignore 2 of them, and one of them will become a headline taken completely out of context. Because what's important, of course, is to dramatize that one series of prepositions and adjectives and nouns taken out of context in order to get you to stay with the channel, because 20 seconds from now, lo and behold, come the ads, which are really what they want you to watch. So it's very hard to call this ecology journalism. I mean, I've been alongside teaching in the business of journalism for almost 30 years, and I find the drain. I mean, working, for instance, for Frontline is a great thing, because Frontline, I don't know, is not an outlier, but it's like an island, where there's occasional boat coming from the mainland, which takes issues back. And we often joke and say, it's okay, you can have people treat you like a textbook for the UPSC exam, but they're at least reading it. And you can draw full context for stories and such like. So it's a miserable thing to talk about this ecology as journalism, because really it's about ads. And the misfortune, of course, is that as things get more complicated in the world and in the region, because they don't report stories in a way that's meaningful for people's understanding, it affects the way politics happens. Because if things are Arnab Goswami style, the politics will follow that. There is no way to have a balanced understanding of India's relationship with China, for instance, and the matter of the border, if news reports it in this sort of fragmented, hyper-jingoistic way. The politics has to follow that. And I'm not saying that politics always follows journalism. Sometimes it can be the other way around. But necessarily, there is this real toxic way in which real effects come from this kind of high-intensity, decontextualized media world, which unfortunately we have to also call journalism. So where does something like Newsclick come in? I mean, I think of Newsclick as low-octane journalism, where you get 15 minutes, 20 minutes sometimes, to have a conversation about something that's deeply complicated and for which there should be really no headline. That's the takeaway. Because really the headline is that this story is very difficult to understand. There are many pieces to it. There are many moving parts. And the politics that will emerge out of it has to emerge out of the complexity, not a reduced vision of reality. If you reduce reality to a cartoon version of what is actually happening, your politics will become cartoonish. So take the case of Syria. I mean, Newsclick is one of the few places that has reported West Asia consistently. I mean, the Indian media in general, or that ecology we call Indian media, has only a fleeting interest in West Asia. The coverage of India and Iran, for instance, is a function of the next time there's a vote in the IAEA, or the next time a commercial group travels to Iran to try to sell medicines or wheat or whatever. That's the nature of reporting. There's been no real in-depth reporting on India's relationship with the region or of what is happening in the region absent India. Meaning, what are the politics of the region? What is the complexity of the region? And in that area, Newsclick has certainly provided one of the few spaces of serious engagement with West Asian politics, North African politics, and the implication of those politics. So as I said, take the case of Syria. Now, it's easy with something like Syria to have a thumbnail opinion and draw out an easy politics. If the politics were so easy, if it was also clear-cut, why would this killing go on for such a long time? If the politics of Palestine, for instance, was so obvious, why would this go on for such a long time? It might be obvious. It might be, say, the obduracy of the American government, its close affiliation with the Israeli government, blocking everything. On one level, it might be very obvious. But yet, there are other stories in there that are very important to uncover. What is the role of Saudi Arabia? Where are the other Arab nations regarding the Palestinians? Or in the case of Syria, again, what is the regional story? What is Turkey's game? How did Assad play the game with the Kurds? Why did he decide to allow northern Syria to become a sort of free zone for the Kurdish resistance? These complexities are not side issues to the story. In fact, particularly in the case of something like Syria, it might be that the complexities are the story. And in fact, if you begin to understand the complexities of the story, you might understand better the complexities of the politics. You might understand better the intractable nature of some of the problems being faced. I would also say that news organizations like Newsclick don't just report the bad side of history. There is the other side as well, by which I mean just wars. There are the consequences of wars. So it's one of the few places where people have talked about, for instance, the humanitarian crisis and what has been that nature. There's sufficient material produced by humanitarian agencies, but I doubt most people know that half the population in Syria of 23 million people has been displaced. About 7 million people inside the country, 5 million people outside the country, and many people have moved into neighbors' or friends' homes. So, the humanitarian crisis is an enormous thing, but one doesn't see reporting on that at all. One doesn't see reporting on humanitarian catastrophes, not of the spectacular so-called natural, sense. That the mainstream media likes to report. They like to report if the tsunami strikes. They like to report an earthquake. They like to report things that appear to be acts of nature. What they don't like to report is things that are a consequence of capitalism. So for instance, the Bangladesh building collapse is reported as a tragedy, but the context will be gone. This is not the first building to collapse and kill over 300 people. I don't know how many of you remember, but in November there was a fire and 172 people burnt. In the last 6 years, there have been 8 building collapses. This is not the first building collapse. So there's a broader context to this. This is not just, a natural disaster or an accident. That's how they like to report. But serious low-octane journalism is about the context. It's about making connections between things. And it's about complexity. And the final thing I'd like to say is, even though I've spoken a lot about complexity and the importance about complexity, sometimes complexity, if you keep saying complexity, that means somebody can accuse you of having lost touch with the dynamics of history. You keep saying things are complex, that means you don't understand what's going on, so why are you wasting my time? Sometimes that can be the case, but that's not what I mean by complexity. I mean there's a complexity of the many different forces that are at work. And even though you can identify each of these forces specifically and show how they are in relation to each other, the resolution of these forces is complicated. So you can analyze the complexity, but your analysis of the complexity need not lead you to a simplistic result. And I believe low-octane journalism, such as practiced by Newsclick, isn't one that promotes simplistic action, which I think dumbs down the general public, because it suggests that here are the three things that can be done, and therefore let's wait for the governments to do it. No, these are much more complicated resolutions that require much more democratic participation. And it's important for people to get involved to resolve these complexities, these contradictions. So low-octane journalism isn't politics by alibi, where you can hope somebody else does the work for you. But it's to draw people in so that they become part of the story itself and get involved in its transformation. So that's what I think Newsclick does. It's low-octane journalism, and we need it more than ever. Thanks a lot.